everybody, and welcome to today's talk. Today's question: can tourism boost Jamaica's economic recovery? That is what we are going to talk and going to discuss today. But before we do that, let me know if you can see and hear me loud and clear. Just want to make sure that the tech is working. Feel free to use the chat, the comment section down below, hit the like button if you enjoy the content. And of course, let me know where you're from, what industry you are in, and any questions that you might have. So let me open my slides here. So the reason why I thought talking about this topic could be a good idea, or could be interesting, besides the fact that I talked about it, I think last year, a little bit about in some of the past live streams. So feel free to check out my past talks and subscribe to the YouTube channel. The main reason why I want to talk about it today is because of the fact that over the last weeks or over the last months, I saw a lot of Jamaican politicians kind of repeatedly praying for the return of the tourists to Jamaica. And therefore, I thought it would be a good idea to explore the question if that's actually a long-term viable strategy and if the tourists actually going to come back. So, status quo. Let's have a look at Jamaica right now from an economic and from a strategic perspective. As you probably know, Jamaica has a population of 3 million, roundabout. The GDP per capita is about $5,000. Unemployment rate around 8.5%. And the main exports are aluminium, tourism, chemicals, and mineral fuels. And according to COVID, around 25% of the population is vaccinated. And when we then look a little bit more at the economic side of things, and we will dive in that a little deeper in a second, we see that over the last 30 years, Jamaica more and more reduced their exports from other sectors, for example, aluminium and the agricultural sector, and increased over time the part of the GDP that comes from tourism, meaning other industry shrunk and tourism sector grew over let's say the last decades. And when we look at the actual exports, export industries besides tourism, well, technically, or not technically, but tourism is of course not really exporting people visiting the island, but from an economic perspective, we're talking about exports here. So, and what we see, around 2/3 of the GDP of the exports, not the GDP of the exports, attribute to some form of aluminium product, aluminium oxide or aluminium ore, refined petroleum, and then some form of agricultural produce or product, hard liquor, other processed fruits and nuts, and so on. You can find all this data at oec.world. And when we then look, where does all these products actually go? Where does Jamaica primarily export their goods and services? And of course, where are their tourists coming from? Then we can see, because of the geographic situation, of course, that North America, meaning United States and Canada, are by far the biggest trading partners of Jamaica at the current state. And then, of course, comes Europe, and then a little bit of China, Asia, and Africa. And I think the reason why, a lot of politicians, or there's so much talking around the tourism sector right now, is of course because of the fact that in 2019, almost 30% of the Jamaican GDP was attributed to travel, tourism, and the hospitality industry. And then with 2020, when the pandemic hit, that of course contracted, decreased to 10, 11, 12%, depending on the data you are looking at. So I think it's fair to say that from roughly 30%, it went down to 10%, meaning we saw a 20%, or 20% points rather, decrease in the tourism sector here. And when we then look at the GDP development after inflation on 2015 basis or starting point, then we see that, of course, that was a really hard hit for the Jamaican economy. We saw a big contraction, and again, mainly, or a big chunk of that came because, if you have a third of your GDP dependent on the tourism sector, and if that tourism sector then shrinks around 2/3, then you will feel that in your overall economy. So I think it's fair to say, Jamaica increased its dependency on tourism over the last decade, or maybe decades, but especially over the last decade. And any GDP growth that we saw over the last 10 years came primarily from the tourism sector. So I think that's pretty clear when we look at the data. And now let's assess that a little bit, look at the pros and cons, because again, everything has two sides. There is no perfect solution here. So what are the pros? What are the pros? Of course, a lot of jobs are directly correlated or directly dependent on the tourism industry. It's not so easy to get really reliable data here, depending on the data source you are looking at. And if you're talking about direct employment, and then maybe third and second grade effects where people directly are dependent on the tourism sector, but something around 100 to 250,000 jobs that are directly attributed to the tourism industry. Often, of course, in the hotel and hospitality industry, and a lot of taxi and travel offers for the tourists. The second big plus is, of course, that because all that money that flows into the country, a lot of US dollars that comes into the country, the government takes their fair, well, that's maybe disputable, but they take their share, and therefore, the government, of course, has a big interest because that's one of their biggest income streams. And then they can use that money to invest in infrastructure, invest in education, invest in healthcare, and so on, and use that money overall to raise the standard of living, the life quality of its citizens, at least in theory. But I think we can agree on that over the last years, over the last decades, we saw a lot of infrastructure investments and a lot of progress. Of course, there's still a long way to go. What are the negative effects that we can see in that context? Again, we have two major pros. We have a lot of jobs that are getting created, and we have a lot of tax income for the government that then can be reinvested into the country, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and so on. So let's have a look at the downside. I think it's not a really smart long-term decision to selling your limited beachfront property. And I don't really care if we talk about selling in the literal sense, or renting out, or leasing, or whatever. That real estate, especially when you're an island, is limited. And even right now, I think it's really hard to even find a piece of beach where you can go without visiting the hotel first, or that belongs to a big resort chain. So that is a strategy that has its natural growth limits, because you only have that amount of real estate that you can sell, that you can rent out. So the only way to long-term increase your income here is to raise your prices, and there is at some point in time a certain limit that visitors or tourists are willing to pay compared to other travel destinations. Jamaica is quite expensive when you compare it to other options that are available in the region, for example, Mexico, or maybe other Caribbean islands, or maybe even South America. So I think you have to be very careful if you bet on this strategy. The second big problem that comes with that strategy is that the profits that are generated by these big hotel chains or these big resorts often go to the overseas mother or the overseas holding companies, meaning these chains are often not owned by Jamaicans or the Jamaican government or so on, meaning you're basically selling the real estate. Someone else is making money out of that, and you get the short-term increase from the sale, but long-term, all the profits basically leave the country. What they are leaving behind is often a lot of environmental damage. I think Jamaica is kind of aware of that, and make sure that they kind of preserve and protect their natural environment. And I think that's super important. But nonetheless, no matter how careful you are, that produce costs, you need to make sure to maintain the ecological systems. You need to maintain, you need to clean up beaches, you need to clean up nature and so on, meaning that just costs money. Maybe not immediately, but someone has to pay for the cleanup, to put it very simple. And I think that's one part of the equation that we shouldn't forget. Then, of course, from a more global or geopolitical strategic perspective, when you have 30% of your GDP coming from tourism, you're just super dependent on the global economy. For example, as you can see here from the Jamaican Tourist Board, in 2019, there were around a little bit more than 4 million visitors per year. And then in the pandemic, that dropped to a little bit more than 1 million, 1.3 million to be exact. And that just makes you very dependent on any economic shock that the global markets hit, or makes you very dependent from the countries where your tourists or your visitors are coming from. For example, let's again think about the fact that Jamaica is rather expensive compared to other travel destinations. We see a high inflation or at least increasing inflation in the US right now. We see increasing gas prices, we see increasing travel costs and so on. And at the end of the day, a holiday is always a luxury item. So I think it's fair to say that there is the possibility that we will never see the pre-pandemic levels of visitors to the Jamaican island, tourists, just because it's too expensive for the average American or average Canadian, and they rather choose cheaper options or don't travel and don't go to holiday at all. So I think we need to keep that in mind and to make sure be aware that that is a possibility. But even if the visitors come back, even if the tourists come back and bring their money with them, in my experience, the average Jamaican doesn't really benefit from that. Because when we look here at this map, from Jamaica and the population distribution, we see that most of Jamaicans live in the south, live in the Kingston area, just when we look at the population density. And as you know, most of the tourists are at the northern coast in the northwest area, Montego Bay, Negril, Ocho-Rios, and so on, where all the big resorts and all the big hotel chains are, meaning the small Jamaican, average Jamaican was maybe renting out an Airbnb or whatever, or whatever way you get in contact with the tourists, are often just too far away where the tourists are. And again, only the bigger organizations, only the bigger companies actually benefit from the tourists. So the question is, does the average Jamaican really benefit if the tourists come back? Conclusion. I think, tourism is no viable long-term economic strategy for no country in general, but also definitely not for Jamaica, and let me explain why. I think over the last 10 years, we saw a kind of sugar high effect in the Caribbean as a whole, or maybe in Jamaica specifically, when we talk about tourism, because the world was booming. We were in a very bull market. Everybody was making money. There was a lot of money in the system, and travel was cheap, and therefore people traveled a lot. And countries like Jamaica benefited from that influx of money. But like a donut or any sweet stuff, it's a kind of cheap and short-lasting energy influx that on the long term causes degeneration, because as we saw earlier, your other industries in that case don't really get the attention and the resources and the investments that they need to grow, or at least to keep up with GDP growth. And you are very tempted as a businessman, as a politician, whoever makes the decision, if a foreign investor comes and say, hey, I buy or build an hotel or a resort or whatever here, I invest money in the infrastructure and bring tourists into the country. Of course, that gives you a lot of money on the short term, but I think it's not really lasting and it's not really sustainable. One of the reasons, or some of the reasons I mentioned earlier on. So the question then becomes, what should we do? What can be solutions? What can be steps that Jamaica can take to make sure they actually have a long-term viable economic strategy? And as a general rule, I would strongly suggest that Jamaica needs to diversify. You need to distribute your risks on more on different areas, so that you not have that kind of how do you call that, core risk, or concentrated risk is rather the better term, so that you don't have a concentrated risk that when one income stream breaks away, in that case tourism, your whole economy gets threatened. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind, that in my opinion, global trade will change, or is already changing massively, meaning we are kind of at the brink of deglobalization. Again, the last 30 years, 40 years, and especially the last 10 years were a period of growth and cheap growth, basically, and global trade. And when we look at this map, we can see that when we look at the global trade, we have basically 4 big trade choke points: Malacca Strait, Strait of Hormuz, and the Suez Canal. And then, of course, in the Caribbean, or closer to the Caribbean, the Panama Canal. And you maybe remember what happened last year, 2021, I think it was, when that one cargo ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. That kind of disrupted global supply chains for weeks, if not even months, and caused billions in damage. And when we then Add to that, that we see kind of energy crisis around the world, fuel crisis around the world, and maybe more conflicts arising, and the US as the global navy, global police force kind of retracting back to their home and focusing more on the home areas, at least from a geographic perspective, because they are now kind of energy and oil sufficient. They don't need the oil from the Middle East. Now all these trade routes become more insecure, they become riskier, and therefore more expensive. And I think Jamaica is very close to one of these choke points, to one of these trade routes with the Panama Canal, and I think that can be a long-term strategic advantage, because I think it's worth thinking about the option, or at least the long-term strategic goal, to think about the Kingston Harbor as a big trade hub in the Western and the Northern Hemisphere, or North America. So what is that? Caribbean, somewhere in between. And that's the big advantage. Jamaica is really in the middle, meaning between the Panama Canal, between South America, between North America, and of course between Europe. And it's an English-speaking country, a relatively secure country compared to maybe Cuba or maybe Haiti and other countries in the area. And it has a really big and deep harbor in Kingston that is actually suitable for big container ships or for big global trade. So if you think about the idea and say, hey, we have one of these big global trade choke points here, and trade will become more complicated and supply chains will become more important in the future. Countries will look to get safer routes and get stuff closer to home. I think, at least for the Americas, Jamaica has a very good strategic position here. But of course, you need to use that. So when we look again at the industries Jamaica is exporting right now, I think the major strategic advice that I would give is to focus more on value-added products. What do I mean by that, besides diversifying industries? For example, let's take Germany as an example here. Why is Germany one of the richest countries in the world and one of the most biggest exporters on the global market? Because what Germany basically does is we import raw materials, steel and whatnot. Then we refine it, we produce it to cars or tanks or weapons and other stuff, machines usually, and then we export them. And in that step between, that's where the actual value is added, meaning we can import relatively cheap materials and then export relatively expensive products. And that's, at least over the last decades, how Germany made most of their money. The question is, of course, is that sustainable? Because again, global trade routes are or will become riskier, therefore it will become more expensive to import raw materials, and it will also become more expensive to produce stuff, just because energy costs are rising. And Germany is especially dependent on energy, in that case Russian energy. Another reason or another example why you should not be dependent, no matter what area, on one big player, but also always make sure that you diversify and diversify your risk and your dependencies. So this is a big industrialized economy like Germany does it or did it in the past. The question is, are they able to do it in the future? The big advantage that Jamaica has, in my eyes, is again, it is very central in all these trade routes, as you can see on the map. But I would not recommend, for example, to focus too much on mining aluminium and just exporting that as a raw material. Besides the fact that this often comes with a lot of environmental problems. In cockpit country, there's a lot of conflict with the locals there. which are complaining, in my eyes, rightfully so, that just the environment gets destroyed to get the ore out of the ground. And again, that's not really where you can make a lot of money, because again, raw materials on the global market are usually relatively cheap, and you can't really you don't really get paid much for it. So what would I recommend? As we saw earlier, a lot of agricultural products are already some part or a bigger chunk, like 10% of the Jamaican economy. And I think that should be at least worth thinking about, meaning you have the opportunity to produce the raw materials at home, sugarcane and whatever you need. Then you can refine it, meaning distill it in that case, and for example, export a value-added product, the world famous Jamaican rum, for example. And I'm sure there are other products that you can create. So that would be one example. Use agricultural products, but don't export them raw, refine them, export them then. Or, and I will talk about that topic in detail next week, next Thursday. So I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, to connect with me on LinkedIn, and to put that date in your calendar, because we will talk about how cannabis can be an economic driver for Jamaica in the future. Same here, you can produce the product at home, you can refine it at home in Jamaica, and then export it to the global market, where you then can ask for higher prices than for the raw materials, and there's actually a demand for it. So to get to the end of this presentation, or to my conclusion, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. There's usually a 30-second delay till I see them. Nonetheless, feel free to put them in there right now, and then I will try to answer them later on. So I repeat myself, but I think 30% GDP from tourism is way too much. I like that kind of graphic here. If you sit on a three-legged stool and one of these legs gets unstable, then sooner or later the whole construction will collapse. And I think, on the left side we see the first chair with 3 legs is probably the last 10 years, relatively stable. A lot of people visited the country, a lot of tourists from the US, Canada, and Europe. Then with the COVID pandemic, that almost dried out completely. That's where we are right now. We see that, shaking stool, and politicians desperately try to kind of hold that or pray for new visitors to come. And if they can't fix this, either with attracting new tourists, new visitors, or building up other industries, then the Jamaican economy probably is going to collapse. I hope that will not happen. We will see how quick the Jamaican economy can adjust or recover in that case. So I think Jamaica needs a new long-term sustainable business model with a clear vision. And in my eyes, that vision shouldn't be to sell your most valuable real estate to foreigners and let them make all the money out of it. And your own population, your own people don't even have beach access without paying for it. Focus on education, make sure that you actually have the labor force, the workforce that is skilled enough to create these value-added products. Again, we didn't even talk about information technology, IT, coding, software, and so on. That's a whole nother sector, but just on very basic industries that are already existing. I think with education, we can do a lot here. And then, of course, generally speaking, make sure that you not only produce a raw material, but rather add value, refine products, meaning, with the sugarcane example, you get sugarcane, you grow sugarcane, you don't sell the sugar, you turn it into rum, and then you sell the rum. That way, you can increase your profits or your single price by multiple. And the general goal, and I think, or I hope I communicated that through the last 30 minutes, is to reduce your external economic dependencies. Again, I think, over the last decades, we lived in a kind of dream world of globalization, free trade, global growth, and kind of global security. And that was very tempting for Caribbean countries then to focus only on tourism as their main source of income. I think that was a mistake. Nonetheless, I think there's enough time to correct that mistake, but we need to do that now, meaning don't focus on more investments in the tourism sector. Hopefully that will recover, maybe not, but make sure that you build up the other industries so that you are on a long term not dependent on foreign visitors or foreign money, and reduce your external economic dependency in general. That being said, thanks for watching. Thanks for taking the time joining me today. If you have any questions, as always, put them in the chat in the comment section. I'm more than happy to read and answer them. If you're not connected on LinkedIn yet, feel free to do so and to reach out to me. And if you liked what you heard, if you like the content, feel free to give it a like, share it with your friends, colleagues, team members. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to my weekly publication, my weekly newsletter, where I share my thoughts and ideas about strategy, economy, and global geopolitical stuff, and everything else that I found interesting and is related to Caribbean and business. All right, I hope to see you next time. I hope to see you next week. Until then, have a good one. Bye-bye.